I saw the way you looked at me during dinner, Daniel said softly, his voice so close that it felt like it wrapped around me. My hand froze mid-air, the dish I was holding suddenly feeling too heavy. His words weren't just unexpected, they were electrifying, slicing through the quiet night like a blade. Daniel was my grandfather's oldest friend, someone I'd seen as a constant figure in our family gatherings. Reserved, charming, always the gentleman. But now, as he stood in the dimly lit kitchen, his gaze locked on mine, he wasn't just a guest in our home. He was something else entirely, someone dangerous, someone I couldn't ignore. I don't know what you mean, I murmured, my voice trembling despite my best effort to steady it. You do, he replied, stepping closer. His towering frame cast a shadow over me, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. I turned away, trying to busy myself with the dishes, but his hand gently caught my wrist. His touch was firm but deliberate, and it sent a shiver down my spine. Don't pretend, he said. This is wrong, I whispered, finally looking up at him. But even as I said it, I knew the conviction wasn't there. Maybe, he admitted, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. But I don't care. And neither do you. My heart raced. He leaned in, his presence overwhelming, his deep blue eyes filled with an intensity that both terrified and thrilled me. The air between us grew heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I began, but the words got caught in my throat as his other hand reached out, tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear. You don't have to say anything, he murmured. I've been alive long enough to recognize what this is. This is nothing, I shot back, finally finding a sliver of resistance within me. You're my grandfather's friend. You're 64, he finished for me, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. Old enough to know better, yes. But young enough to want it all the same. His honesty stunned me. I could feel my resolve slipping, replaced by something darker, something I couldn't control. I should go, I said quickly, pulling my hand away, but his gaze pinned me in place. Do you really want to? He asked, his voice lowering to a whisper. Or are you just afraid of what might happen if you stay? I hesitated, and that moment of indecision felt like an eternity. His words were cutting through every barrier I'd tried to build. He wasn't asking for permission, he was daring me to face the truth I didn't want to admit. Daniel, this can't happen, I said, stepping back, but the space between us only made me feel more exposed. It already has, he replied. And you know it. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. I needed to escape, to put distance between us before I did something I couldn't take back. But as I turned toward the doorway, his voice stopped me cold. You can run if you want, he said softly. But you'll come back. And when you do, I'll be here. I didn't look back as I hurried out of the room, my heart pounding so loudly that I couldn't hear anything else. But his words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I climbed the stairs and shut the door to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, trembling, my mind replaying every second of what had just happened. I should have felt disgusted or horrified, but instead, there was only confusion. And beneath that confusion, a thrill I couldn't deny. As I lay down, staring at the ceiling, I told myself I would avoid him for the rest of his visit. This had been a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment that couldn't happen again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. If tonight was any indication, this was just the beginning. And something inside me whispered that whatever came next would change everything. The next morning, I woke up with the memory of his words echoing in my mind. You'll come back. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just an unsettling dream, something my mind fabricated in the haze of the night. But the moment I walked downstairs and saw him sitting at the breakfast table, casually sipping coffee, I knew it hadn't been a dream. He glanced up as I entered, and for a split second, his eyes locked with mine. My heart betrayed me, skipping a beat before I forced myself to look away. Grandfather, oblivious to the weight in the air, was talking about some neighbor's garden project. Daniel nodded along politely, but I caught the faintest twitch of a smirk at the corner of his mouth, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tension between us. I sat across from him, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on my plate, but it was impossible to ignore the heat of his gaze. Every time I looked up, his eyes were already on me, studying me like I was a puzzle he had all the time in the world to solve. Pass the butter, will you? He said, his voice calm, almost indifferent. I hesitated, my hand trembling slightly as I slid the dish across the table. His fingers brushed mine when he took it, lingering for a fraction of a second too long. I pulled my hand back quickly, trying to steady my breathing. "You're awfully quiet this morning," Grandfather remarked, glancing at me. "I didn't sleep well," I replied, forcing a smile. Daniel's smirk deepened, but he said nothing. Later that afternoon, when Grandfather went out to run errands, I thought I'd finally have a moment to breathe, to collect my thoughts. I retreated to the living room with a book, hoping to lose myself in someone else's story. But Daniel was there too, sitting in the armchair by the window, flipping through a newspaper. "You're avoiding me," he said without looking up. I froze, my book clutched tightly in my hands. "I'm not," I lied, keeping my eyes on the floor. He chuckled softly, the sound low and knowing. "You're terrible at lying." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as I sat down on the couch, as far from him as the room allowed. I could feel his presence like a gravitational pull, drawing me in even when I tried to resist. "Why are you doing this?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He folded the newspaper and set it aside, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Doing what?" "You know what," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. You're messing with my head." "Am I?" he said, his tone maddeningly calm. "Or am I just saying what you've been too afraid to admit to yourself?" I shot up from the couch, intending to walk out, but he was faster. He stood in my path, blocking the doorway with his imposing frame. "Let me go," I demanded, my voice trembling. "Do you want me to?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. I hated how my body betrayed me, how the tension between us made it impossible to move, to breathe. His hand reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. "Daniel, this is wrong," I said, my voice cracking. "Maybe," he admitted, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. "But does it feel wrong?" I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came. His question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, until I finally broke free, pushing past him and fleeing up the stairs. That evening, I resolved to avoid him completely. I stayed in my room, pretending to be engrossed in a movie on my laptop, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I heard footsteps outside my door, my heart raced, half expecting him to knock. But the knock never came. Instead, I found myself replaying the moments from earlier, the way his hand felt against my skin, the way his voice seemed to burrow under my defenses. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that this was wrong, a darker part of me wondered what it would be like to stop fighting. The next morning, I woke up determined to act like nothing had happened. I came downstairs, ready to bury everything under a facade of normalcy. But Daniel wasn't playing along. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, he walked into the kitchen, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth and unbothered. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Morning." He stepped closer, and I could feel the heat radiating off him. "Still avoiding me?" he asked, his tone teasing. "I'm not doing this with you," I snapped, slamming my mug on the counter. "Oh, but you are," he said, his voice dropping. "Whether you admit it or not." His hand brushed against mine as he reached for the sugar, and it sent a jolt through me, like an electric current. I pulled my hand back sharply, but he didn't move away. "You can't keep running," he said softly, his eyes boring into mine. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was, I didn't want to run. Not anymore. The day passed in a haze, the tension between us building with every stolen glance, every accidental touch. By the time the sun began to set, I was a mess of nerves and confusion. When Grandfather retired to his room early that night, I found myself alone with Daniel again. I was standing by the window in the living room, staring out at the darkening sky, when I heard him enter the room. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice soft. "I don't have anything to say," I replied, not turning around. He crossed the room, his footsteps barely audible, until he was standing just behind me. "That's not true," he said. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want from me?" "You already know," he said simply. His honesty left me breathless. I didn't have the strength to argue anymore, not when every part of me ached to close the distance between us. "You're going to ruin everything," I whispered. "Maybe," he said, stepping closer. But haven't you ever wanted to destroy something just to see what happens next? I should have stopped him. I should have walked away. But when his hand reached for mine, I didn't pull away. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The house was silent, the kind of quiet that felt heavier at night. I padded down the hallway barefoot, the cool floor grounding me as I tried to shake off the restless thoughts circling in my head. I only wanted a glass of water, just a moment of calm before I could attempt to sleep again. But as I turned the corner into the kitchen, there he was. Daniel. He was sitting at the table, the dim light from above casting long shadows across his face. A glass of something amber sat in front of him, and his posture was relaxed, almost casual. But his eyes, they were far from casual. "You can't sleep either," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. I froze, gripping the edge of the doorframe. I hadn't expected anyone to be awake, let alone him. "No," I admitted softly, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Just needed some water." He nodded toward the counter. "Go ahead." I stepped into the room, aware of how small it felt with him there. Every movement I made seemed amplified, from the creak of the cupboard door to the soft splash of water filling my glass. His gaze followed me the entire time, making the air feel thick and charged. When I turned back toward the door, he stood, blocking my path. "Daniel," I said, my voice catching slightly. "Stop," he said quietly, but there was a command in his tone that made my pulse quicken. I hesitated, holding the glass close to my chest like it was some kind of shield. "What are you doing?" "You know exactly what I'm doing," he replied, stepping closer. "You're playing a dangerous game," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "And so are you," he countered, his lips curving into that maddening, knowing smile. I tried to move around him, but he shifted, his hand brushing against my arm. The contact was light, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that stopped me in my tracks. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, more forcefully this time. "Because I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And because you feel the same way." His words hung in the air, daring me to deny them. I wanted to. I wanted to push him away, to say something that would make this all go away. But the truth lodged itself in my throat, refusing to let me lie. "This is wrong," I said finally, but even to my own ears, the words sounded weak. "Then walk away," he challenged, his voice soft but unrelenting. I should have. Every rational part of me screamed to leave, to put as much distance between us as possible. But my feet didn't move. Instead, I stood there, caught in the pull of him, unable to break free. He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek. His touch was warm, his fingers rough but gentle. "You're not running," he murmured. "I don't know how," I admitted, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. For a moment, we stood there, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator. His face was so close now, his breath warm against my skin. "You have no idea how much I want to kiss you right now," he said, his voice raw, almost desperate. I closed my eyes, torn between the part of me that wanted to give in and the part that knew we were crossing a line we could never uncross. When I opened them again, his face was even closer, and before I could think, before I could decide, his lips brushed against mine. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if he was waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, the glass slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. The sound barely registered as his hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer. "Daniel, we can't," I whispered against his lips, even as my fingers clutched at his shirt. "Then tell me to stop," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. But I couldn't. The sound of footsteps upstairs made us break apart suddenly, both of us breathing heavily. I stepped back, my hands trembling as I tried to collect myself. "This is insane," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "I know," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "But it's real." Before I could respond, the footsteps grew louder, and I realized with a jolt that grandfather was coming downstairs. "You need to leave," I hissed, pushing him toward the back door. He didn't argue, slipping out into the night without another word. I quickly grabbed a towel to clean up the broken glass, my heart racing as grandfather appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice groggy. "Just dropped a glass," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded, too tired to question further, and shuffled back upstairs. When I finally returned to my room, I sank onto the bed, my mind spinning. Every nerve in my body was alive, every thought tangled in the memory of his touch, his kiss. I told myself it couldn't happen again, that I wouldn't let it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The day dragged on in unbearable tension. Every movement Daniel made seemed amplified. Every glance in my direction sent waves of anticipation coursing through me. Grandfather was completely oblivious, engrossed in his usual routines, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. Daniel kept his distance throughout the day, but it wasn't a retreat. It was deliberate, like a predator circling its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was charged, brimming with the weight of everything unsaid. That evening, after Grandfather had gone to bed, I retreated to my room, hoping to escape the mounting pressure. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the blank page of my journal, trying to write but unable to string together a single coherent thought. The knock on my door came softly, but it echoed like a thunderclap in the stillness of the house. I froze, my pen slipping from my fingers. "Come in," I said, though my voice was barely above a whisper. The door opened, and there he was. Daniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed him, dark, stormy, and filled with something I couldn't name. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady but laced with an urgency that made my pulse quicken. "About last night?" I asked, trying to sound composed, though my heart was pounding. "About everything," he replied, taking a step closer. I stood, instinctively backing away until my legs hit the edge of the bed. "Daniel, this has to stop," I said, though even to my own ears, it sounded unconvincing. "Does it?" he asked, tilting his head. "Because I don't think you believe that any more than I do." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, he wasn't. Every fiber of my being was drawn to him, despite the danger, despite the impossibility of it all. He took another step, closing the distance between us. "You can tell me to leave, and I will," he said, his voice low and steady. "But if you don't..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The unspoken promise hung in the air between us, daring me to make a choice. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Daniel, we can't." "We already have," he interrupted, his hand reaching up to brush against my cheek. His touch was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt through me that left me breathless. "You're going to ruin everything," I whispered, though I didn't move away. "Maybe," he said softly, his thumb tracing the curve of my jaw. "But I can't pretend anymore. And I don't think you can either." His words were a challenge, a confession, and a plea all at once. My mind screamed at me to push him away, to end this before it went any further. But my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch, drawn to the warmth of him. "Daniel," I began, but my voice broke, the words catching in my throat. He leaned in, his forehead resting lightly against mine. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. "Just say the word, and I'll walk away." I closed my eyes, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have said it. I should have ended it right there. But instead, I stood frozen, caught in the gravity of him, unable to break free. He took my silence as an answer. His lips brushed against mine, softly at first, testing the waters. When I didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, his hands moving to my waist, pulling me closer. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and utterly consuming. I lost myself in him, in the heat of his touch and the weight of his presence. Every rational thought disappeared, replaced by a flood of emotions I couldn't control. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, I pulled away, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "This is insane," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe," he admitted, his eyes searching mine. "But it's real." The sound of footsteps down the hall shattered the moment, and we both froze. "Grandfather." Daniel stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Think about what you want," he said quietly, before slipping out of the room and disappearing down the hall. I sat back on the bed, my mind spinning. Every nerve in my body was alive, every thought tangled in the memory of his touch, his kiss. I knew I should feel guilty, ashamed even. But instead, all I could think about was how much I wanted him. The knock on my door startled me out of my thoughts. "Everything okay in there?" Grandfather's voice called out, muffled through the door. "Yes," I replied quickly, forcing my voice to sound calm. "Just getting ready for bed." He mumbled something in response and shuffled back down the hall, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The logical part of me knew this was dangerous, that we were walking a razor's edge. But the part of me that had kissed him back, that had wanted him more than I'd ever wanted anything, couldn't bring itself to care. His gaze lingered on me, heavy with unspoken meaning. The house was silent, its stillness amplifying the tension between us. We were alone now, the world outside forgotten. His presence filled the room, his closeness almost suffocating. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't speak. My pulse quickened as his words hung in the air, daring me to deny them. I dropped my gaze, hoping to find some sense of control, but the warmth of his closeness broke through every defense I tried to muster. "If this is wrong, tell me to stop," he said, his hand lightly brushing against mine. His touch was gentle but deliberate, like he was testing the fragile boundary between us. I didn't move. I didn't pull away. My silence said everything I couldn't bring myself to voice. He stepped closer, his fingers grazing my wrist, then trailing upward with an agonizing slowness. When his hand reached my shoulder, he paused, his breath warm and steady against my skin. "You're afraid," he said, his tone low but certain. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice trembling under the weight of the moment. "Then let me show you," he whispered, his fingers tracing along the curve of my neck. The air between us was thick, charged with something neither of us could control. My heart raced as his hand moved upward, his thumb brushing the line of my jaw. I felt frozen, unable to stop what was happening and, deep down, realizing I didn't want to. His touch lingered, soft yet commanding, as if he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into the warmth of his hand, the weight of the moment pulling me inescapably toward him. "I've wanted this," he began, his voice raw with emotion, "for longer than I should admit." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words, of his touch. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was a line we couldn't cross, but his hand didn't falter. It slid down my arm, stopping just below my elbow, grounding me in a way that felt both terrifying and safe. "Tell me to stop," he said again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I opened my eyes and met his, searching for something, reason, logic, an escape. But all I found was him. And then, in the quiet stillness of that room, it happened. I can't describe it, not fully. It wasn't just a touch, or a moment, or a decision. It was everything crashing down at once, all the unspoken feelings and stolen glances and impossible tension spilling over into something we could no longer contain. When it was over, the silence between us was heavier than ever. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing as I tried to process what we'd done. He stood nearby, his eyes watching me, unreadable yet full of something I couldn't name. "You're my sweetest secret," he said finally, his voice breaking through the quiet like a whispered promise. I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I knew was that there was no going back now. Whatever this was, whatever it had become, it was ours. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop.